Good morning, everyone. So nice to see some of you here today. You know, when I became the supervising minister of Sacramento Betsuin, one of the things I wanted to do was bring a variety of guest speakers here to Sacramento, that people that maybe you haven't had a chance to hear before, and speakers that I have hold the highest respect and admiration for. Today is one of those days. We're so fortunate to have Reverend Dr. Duncan Williams. He is an ordained minister in the Zen tradition. Not Shin Buddhism like we are, but of course he's very well versed in Shin Buddhism as well. I've known him over many years now, and for the past 17 years, he has been doing research and put it into a book called American Sutra, which is about what happened to Buddhists during the internment camp during World War II. He's going to be speaking about this at our 11:30 BEC class. I hope those of you who can attend will attend. It's amazing what he has shared in this book, American Sutra. Dr. Williams has taught at UC Berkeley and UC Irvine, and presently he's at University of Southern California, USC. So UCLA fans, put your sports rivalry to the side and let's listen to a USC professor, okay? Presently, he's the director of the Shinso Ito Center for Japanese Religions and Culture at the University of Southern California. Without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Reverend Dr. Duncan Williams.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm so happy to be here with all of you on this day, the Eitaikyo service. So I thought maybe, as Reverend Harada just mentioned, I could speak to you today about the Eitaikyo, what that means and why we do it, but from my lineage or tradition of Buddhism. Reverend Harada said some kind words that I know something about Jodo Shinshu Buddhism, but that's not really true. And I don't want to misspeak and misrepresent what this service means from this tradition's point of view. But I can say something about what it means in my tradition. I grew up in Japan. My mom is Japanese and my dad is British. But I grew up there until I was 17 or so, and I became ordained as a Buddhist priest when I was 21 and spent some time in a Japanese monastery. But over the time, I have settled here in the United States, and I just turned 50 a couple of weeks ago, and I'm finally I put in my papers for naturalization and to become a U.S. citizen, hopefully in time for next year's election. But anyway, so I've been a Japanese citizen for much of my growing up, and so I don't look it, and I have a name like Duncan Williams, so it is what it is. But so I grew up. Because I had a Japanese mom and a British father, really kind of struggling with this question of who am I? Am I British or am I Japanese? My dad is, because he's British, we went to, on every Sunday, the Church of England, or Episcopalian in the American usage, church in Tokyo called St. Albans Church, and my mom would have temple, and so I kind of sometimes Buddhist, sometimes Christian, sometimes, my dad would only speak in English to us kids, and my mom would only speak in Japanese. And so at some point I became very, concerned about this question of who I am. And it turned out that Buddhism, the path that the Buddha taught, was a really helpful one for helping me understand how I could be in the world and embrace both my parents, embrace both my languages and cultures and everything. And it's because Buddhism has something to say about the self. And I'm going to try to connect this to Eitaikyo, what we're doing today. That Buddhism has a vision of who one is that is both dynamically changing and in interconnection to everything else. So one kind of vision of the self is that you have a self, it's kind of autonomous from everything else, and it's kind of static. It's you and it's you forever. But that's not what the Buddha taught. The Buddha taught that the self is always shifting and changing. We sometimes use the word impermanent. Things are shifting and changing. And that it's not autonomous but interdependent. That our cells are, like I was back in the back of the temple here drinking some coffee. So, water, if clouds don't exist, there's no water. And I wouldn't have my coffee. If somebody didn't grow those coffee beans, so everything that makes up my body, my mind, there's interconnections sideways with every living being. But for Eitaikyo, one thing I want to talk about today is how we're interconnected, not just across beings in a given time, but how we're interconnected through generations of past, present, and future. How we can think about our way of being, our identity through time. So that's what I want to talk about today. And there are three subjects I want to kind of get into. One has to do with the idea of our ancestors, people that have come before us, and how we are karmically connected to them. That's one topic. Second topic is cooking. It seems unrelated, but I promise you it's somehow connected. I'm going to talk about cooking. And the third topic I'm going to talk about is freedom. Again, seems unrelated to cooking and ancestors, but I promise you it all comes together. Hopefully it comes together. Okay, so ancestors. Up on the Naijin, up here in front of the altar, I see a book and it says, my eyes are getting bad at 50. So Eitaikyo, I think, right? So it means that book has the name, I didn't check, so I think it has the names of all of the Sangha members here at the Buddhist Church Sacramento who have passed away, people who have come before us. And that once a year, or in some places more than once a year, there's an occasion to have a service that recognizes all of these people who've come before us. And that everybody who's in that book, we may not have the opportunity to chant all of their names, but sometimes in my tradition, we chant their names and then we end with, let's just say Tanaka and Yamamoto, like Tanaka ke dai dai, like the Tanaka family that died, the generation after generation, Yamamoto ke dai dai, and we just keep on chanting all the names of all the people who have made a community, a Buddhist community, a Sangha, and how we are, and it's a moment to reflect on how we are interlinked, interconnected with all these people that came before us. And it doesn't have to be just about temple members or Sangha members. It really is about just anybody in our past and thinking about what we have inherited from them. As I mentioned, my dad's British and my mom's Japanese, and the chance of them meeting back in I think they met in 1961. I was born in 1969, but at that time it wasn't so common, for a British person, Japanese person to meet. And I think back in the day, my Japanese family, my mom came from a big family of 10 kids. And during World War II, my uncles served in the Japanese Imperial Army, and I think one of them was in the Tokkotai, the kamikaze corps. So that's the kind of family, my Japanese side, And my British side, my British grandfather, he served in the Royal Air Force, the RAF, And so I think my British side was telling my dad, are you sure you can't find any nice British girl, And my Japanese side family was like, are you sure you need to really marry a British man? Is there no one in the archipelago of Japan that is suitable? But they married, and my brother and I were born, and And so for me to exist, my parents needed to have existed. My grandparents need to have existed. And of course, once the grandkids were born, they didn't question it so much. It was okay that two countries that were formerly enemies would be connected through marriage. But again, it's kind of miraculous how it all happened. And if we all look back on our own lives, we may find moments with our parents' generation, our grandparents' generation, it could be further on, of something quite mysterious, quite as a kind of like the karmic conditions necessary for people to have met and then made a next generation. That's something to ponder, that we are the products of many, many generations, of many, many mysterious karmic connections, right? And so let's think about this service, Eitaikyo. Japanese people love to shorten things, like so everything like Family Mart is Famima, or McDonald's is Makudo, or they like to shorten things. So Eitaikyo originally was Eitaidokyo, and Dokyo means Kyo means sutra. So today we chanted Juseige. So we chant some sacred scripture, some sacred text. And doku means to chant, right? And then etai, these two characters, what do they mean? So can mean like long, or usually translated into English like eternal or perpetual or perpetuity, kind of meaning like a long time, And because we're Buddhists and we believe in impermanence, we don't usually say eternity, so we say perpetual or something like that. I think I heard Duncan say, the chairperson today, use the word perpetual. And then tai, usually pronounced dai. Again, Japanese people, how like in Japanese American communities, there's that we say issei and a nisei and sansei, like that, you don't say. But that's kind of not wrong, but it's like, it's sedai. Isedai, nisedai, sansedai. Sedai means, so the character here, dai or tai, means together with that word, generation. So when we say dai or tai, it means like perpetual generations. So all these generations from the past, but also into the future, we are recognizing, remembering when we do a memorial service for Eitaikyo, all right? And in specific, of course, the members of this particular Sangha we have in this book. So that's what we do. So that's point number one, that we hear Eitaikyo to remember how we are made up of, I think Reverend Ogui's quote was mentioned by the chairperson today, how we are made of generations, how we're made of this past makes us today, all right? Now I want to move to cooking, and I know it's a little odd, but in my tradition of Soto Zen Buddhism, the founder of my, just like you have Shinran as the founder of this particular lineage of Buddhism, Jodo Shinshu, in my school of Buddhism, Soto Zen Buddhism, right around the same time as Shinran, there was a Zen master called Dogen, lived from 1200 to 1253, and he wrote a big text called the Shobo Genzo, but also wrote a really wonderful manual, a guideline called Tenzo Kyokun. So that's what I'm going to focus on right now. Tenzo Kyokun is a text that literally translates to instructions to the monastic cook. Inside a monastery, there's somebody that is in charge of the kitchen, and that person's called Tenzo. And in the Zen tradition, you'd think like cooking is maybe not as important as teaching Dharma or chanting leader or meditation leader. But in the Zen monastery, other than the abbot, the number 2 ranked most important person in the ranks of a monastery is the cook. And so Dogen wrote a guideline, a book called Instructions to the Monastic Cook. And in this book, he talks about the general attitude, as well as specific, rules about how to run a kitchen. And he says things like, one of the most important kind of like specific rules are don't waste anything. In Japanese we say mottainai, like don't be wasteful and careless with ingredients in the kitchen. And so there's a long tradition of trying to make sure you're very careful about ingredients, don't throwing anything away if you don't have to, And so that's one kind of thing. But also he was talking about the mental attitude that a cook should have. Because when you cook, and you cook with care, you cook with love for people, you cook with attention, it tastes different than when it's hastily slapped together, right? You can kind of sense that, right? And inside the monastery, the idea was that all these young monks are trying to pursue a spiritual path and to sustain and nourish their body and their minds. A Zen cook, the monastery, would have to provide some sustenance, one that would feed their physical body but also their spiritual life, So that's what was the main kind of ideas in this book called Tenzo Kyokun, the Instructions to the Monastic Cook. And there's a metaphor that's at the heart of this book. And the metaphor that is used is that for a Zen monk, the key thing has two kind of like aspects. The key thing of how to cook. The first thing is you have to know what ingredients you have in the kitchen, in the pantry, what do you have? A cook who doesn't know what's in the pantry, what's in the refrigerator, right? That's step one. You gotta master that. You gotta know what's there. And then step two is when you put whatever ingredients you have together and you make a meal for all those other monks, you need to cook it with the right attitude. It's not about yourself. It's not about winning celebrity chef shows or anything. It's about how do you create a meal that's going to really spiritually and physically nourish other people. How do you be of service to help others? That's the attitude important in cooking. So that's what he said. And another thing he said was that when you look at your ingredients and you're surveying your inventory of things, he said, if you have great ingredients, you can be a mediocre cook and still cook up something pretty decent. But he said a great cook is somebody who can take mediocre ingredients and make a supreme, wonderful, amazing meal. That's a Zen cook. All right. Now I said it's a metaphor. So although it's true that it's a part of how you're supposed to run your kitchen, it's a metaphor because the kitchen is actually ourselves. Remember I talked about identity, about looking into yourself. Who am I? When I was growing up, that's actually Buddhism. Buddhism is really about surveying yourself, understanding what ingredients you have in yourself. And when you have a good assessment of your physical, mental, emotional self, then you can start Buddhist practice. Because without understanding yourself, it's really hard to do Buddhism. So that's actually the metaphor, is that we are, in some sense, whether you practice meditation, whether you practice what is reflection, whatever it is, through the Nembutsu, you come to know who you are. And by the way, most of us, we've got some not so good ingredients in ourselves, right? If we're honest. So, my wife reminds me of my bad ingredients all the time. So we have mirrors around us as well, other people, family, colleagues at work. They serve as mirrors, and we come to know who we are, including the bad ingredients. But remember, the rule is, even if you have bad ingredients, to practice Buddhism means you take whatever bad ingredients you have and work with them to make something worthy. Something worthy, a meal, an offering, something of service to the world, not just for yourself, but for alleviating the suffering of everyone, helping the spiritual path of everyone. Can we do that? That's the challenge of Buddhism. That's the challenge that's come down generation after generation to all of us. So that's cooking. And so I want to get to the last thing, freedom. We, sometimes in my tradition, we call our practice ceaseless practice. Ceaseless practice. And there's a Japanese phrase that actually comes from the Zen Buddhist tradition, nanakorobi yaoki. Nanakorobi yaoki. 7 times, nanakorobi means 7 times falling down, yaoki means on the 8th time you get up. Okay. Back in the early Zen tradition, there was a famous Buddhist monk called Bodhidharma, or in Japanese, Dharma. And in Japan, they have this little doll called the Dharma doll. It's kind of like, people use it like, it's a red, kind of usually red, sometimes white. They're different kind of dolls, but basically it's a round doll where people put in, like, the eyes are kind of like white, and then people have a practice of like circling in the eyes, and you make like a vow, like, I'm going to pass this exam, or I'm going to become the world champion in X, and then you put in a little eye, and then when you fulfill it, you put in the second eye. Politicians do that when they go up for elections, stuff like that in Japan. But it's like that because Bodhidharma was known to have strong, like, determination. He's said to have sat for 9 years facing a wall inside of a cave and lost use because he's meditating too much. I don't recommend this, by the way, but he lost use of his legs. And so that's why the doll is round. It's like it's weighted in such a way that if you tip it over, it's kind of round, so it comes back up again. 7 times down, 8 times getting up. 1,000,000 times down, 1,000,001 times getting up. That's Buddhist practice. It's not about perfection. It's not about trying to be perfect at Buddhism. It's about when you get off the path, when you fall down, when you stray away, you just get back straight up again. And if you do that 1,000,000 times, it's 1,000,001 times you get back up. And that's ceaseless. Because in Buddhist time, there's no it's beginningless beginning, endless end. It's not like a start and an end. So our practice is continuous. Our practice is Eitai, it's perpetual, over generations. We inherit things from our ancestors, but what we do now is part of this stream of perpetuity, of ceaseless practice. And it's said that practice of just getting back up, that's liberation, that's freedom. Recently, I was asked to some young people who asked me, like, they're being bothered by some kids in school about, like, they're being Buddhist, and I think they had some evangelical kind of friends in the Christian tradition who were inviting them, like, Sunday to come to their church, and they were like, Professor Williams, what do we say that's, like, simple, like kind of like can you give us like a formula that's easy to remember for how to talk to people about what is Buddhism when we're asked something about what we do in our faith and why we go to temple and so on. And so I said, how about this one? Wisdom times compassion equals freedom. Our ceaseless practice is really like a bird flying into air. One wing is called wisdom, the ability to see things clearly, the ability to see the ingredients inside of yourself, who you are. And the other wing is compassion, the ability to serve all the other monks, the ability to serve in the world. Because if you don't have both wings, you can't fly. All right? And when that bird flies to freedom, that's liberation. That's freedom that we're seeking in Buddhism, trying to alleviate suffering in the world of ourselves and other people. And I encourage them to use the word freedom. You usually say, like, jobutsu, like, or liberation, there's other words. I was like, in America, very few people are like, freedom, boo, freedom is a good word. So I was like, just use freedom. That's what we do as Buddhists. We're living a ceaseless practice of freedom. And it's a discipline. It asks us to get back up every time we fall off the path. And it's not about perfection, but about just getting back up each time. And we come once a year, Eitaikyo, to remember our ancestors, remember those who've come before us, who've shown us this pathway. And it's up to us to keep getting up, to keep flying to freedom. Namah Myoho.